Over the last few years, I've had a lot of experience using Minecraft worldgen to create awesome new worlds, and over that time I've gotten a pretty good idea of what features, aka the various shapes and blocks that populate biomes and give them their identities, are available to us. Huge mushrooms, pumpkin patches, and even the desert wells are all examples of features, and by far my favorite feature is the tree. Let me explain. To understand what makes a good and interesting feature, we first need to take a look at some features that are less cool and useful. The various corals that populate the warm ocean biome are absolutely beautiful, both above and below the surface. Each of the different shapes of coral are different features, but we can't actually control anything about those shapes, like how tall they are, how long they are, and things like that. And we also aren't able to change the blocks that they are made of, or the blocks that appear on top of them, nor at what frequencies. Which makes coral as a feature very limited. It's great when you want to use it exactly like this, but if you want any kind of configurability, it's completely useless. The huge crimson and warped fungus that populate the crimson and warped forest biomes here in the Nether are a little bit better. We are able to change the blocks that the stems and the caps are made of, as well as what blocks kind of randomly pop up within those caps, specifically things like the shroom lights. We can also change the block that gets placed beneath them, specifically in this case crimson nylium. So this is already quite a lot better than the corals. However, we can only pick one block type for each sort of segment of these features. We can only make the cap warped fungus blocks or nether warp blocks or so on. We can only change the stem to be a single kind of block rather than making it a random mixture of several. We also aren't able to control the size or size range of any part of this. So we can't change how tall the stems are, we can't change how wide the caps are. All of that just gets handled automatically by the feature. We can't configure it at all. Not too long ago, Mojang removed the random lakes of water that appear on the surface and underground here in the overworld, but they kept these lava lakes. And these are just a little bit better, kind of in between the huge fungus and the corals. We can change which block makes up the fluid, the actual lake part of the lake, and we can change which block makes up the rim that covers the outside and the bottom of these lakes. And these do support block state providers. But we still can't change the size of these lakes, and those block state providers don't work the way you would expect. If you make it so that there's a random chance for this stone to be copper ore, for example, it's not going to make it a mixture of stone and copper ore. It's instead going to make a random assortment of lava lakes either entirely stone or entirely copper ore. And this is very different from anywhere else that we would normally use a block state provider. Taking this all together, it's clear that the ideal feature is one that supports block state providers for all of its various segments that actually allow for some random assortment even within the same feature, and that allows us to have a great degree of configurability over the size and shape of the feature. And this is why trees are my favorite. You might recognize trees primarily as the things that populate the entire overworld. They are what make up forests, they're what sparsely populate things like plains, and that is pretty much all that they're used for. But because they have such a great degree of configurability, they can be used for so much more. So to explain why, I've set up this flat world so we can take a look at a few different kinds of trees. Of course, we've got our classic oak tree that is typically between 4 and 6 blocks tall, and it's got a blob of foliage on top of it. Always the same, of course. And it has the fancy oak tree variant that is going to have a couple of branches to allow these leaves to extend out a little bit. We also have birch trees, which are pretty similar to the oak trees, but just use some different blocks. And these mega jungle trees, which are still one of the largest tree types available in the game. What sets these apart is that their trunks are 2 blocks wide, and they have a couple of branches on the outside that extend out in addition to the blob on top. So a little bit different than the fancy oak tree, which branches kind of meld together to create a very large bulbous blob of foliage, as opposed to these independent branches. Acacia trees work pretty similarly. They have a couple of additional branches that can pop off of them to create some separate blobs of foliage, and these foliage shapes are more similar to the ones you might find on a jungle tree than a birch or oak tree. We of course have the dark oak tree and the new variant, the pale oak tree. These both are exactly the same, except the blocks have changed, very much like the oak and birch tree, although the pale oak tree does have some additional variety with decorators, such as the hanging moss here, and the chance for creaking hearts on the inside. The cherry oak tree is super duper wide. This again has a couple of branches, but they're designed differently, they're coated differently than some of the other branches we've seen so far, and they also create both sort of these two separate blobs of foliage, but ultimately because of how close the branches are, they end up melding together quite a bit to create these really wide umbrella shapes. Now, despite the incredible variety among all of these trees, these are all made with the exact same feature. Even dramatically different shaped trees like the cherry tree or this mangrove tree that has all these roots hanging down from it are all made exactly the same way. What allows them to be different is that they have that great degree of configurability. Specifically, trees allow you to select a trunk type, a foliage type, and then allow for block state providers for the leaves, for the trunk, and for the block underneath them, the dirt provider, so to speak. Now, obviously, most of them just use dirt, but the fact remains that you could make this whatever you want if you were making some kind of a custom tree. And though I don't have one set up here, the azalea tree is a great example of how you can have a tree that has multiple types of leaves even among the same tree. So to take a look at some examples of the kinds of things that you can do, I'm going to clear away this mangrove tree. This is an example of a dead tree that you might be able to make. Maybe it's been charred by some kind of apocalypse, so it's made of basalt to really demonstrate that. I'm using air for the foliage provider, and all the foliage is set to 0 anyway, so none of that's able to spawn, and it allows us to create this very empty, very dead-looking tree. The branches really help accentuate this far more than if we were to use just a straight trunk provider like the normal birch or oak trees. And you can do some other crazy stuff, like making custom giant mushrooms that look like trees, or even look like just different or more interesting mushrooms. This is using a straight trunk provider and the acacia foliage type, and so it creates this very nice mushroom cap, not dissimilar to what you might find on a normal huge brown mushroom, but it's just a little bit more shapely, and again, using that block state provider to have random shroom lights mixed in. You can even use custom trees to make shapes that don't even look like trees. I gotta clear this away, but take a look at this example. This is a pyramid. It's made of cut sandstone and chiseled sandstone, but it's actually a tree. We're just using a cut and chiseled sandstone block state provider for a straight trunk, and then we're using the pine foliage provider to create this awesome stair step design. So just like you can have a tree that has no foliage, you can have a tree that is mostly foliage and use that shape to your advantage to make something completely new. Something else we have at our disposal thanks to that mangrove is these awesome roots down here, which also have some great configurability to them. This is a very basic example, but you can use roots to create some crazy sort of alien type shapes. Once again, that doesn't even quite look like a tree. You could use this underwater to create some kind of really magical or majestic sort of kelp-like situation that looks like it is sprouting from or even walking along the ground. Once again, using that block state provider to have amethyst blocks and budding amethyst blocks. And like I mentioned, the root configurability is off the charts. You can decide how long you want them to be, how far away you want them to be allowed to stretch from the trunk, how likely it is that they're going to bend, so you can create these cool little knees like here, or sometimes have straight ones like this, and you can even place things on top of them like the mangrove does with the moss carpet. You don't even have to use them just to make things particularly tall or raise things up. If you do something like this, you can use the roots to create just more dynamic and interesting trunk shapes, like this cool little crystallized mushroom thing. It's a normal straight trunk provider, but we're using some roots to kind of stretch it out a little bit. They're only allowed to go so far, and they have a maximum bend rate so that they always create this sort of stair-step design, not unlike the pyramid there. And you don't even need a trunk at all. You can do something like this with jungle wood to create almost like a bramble or a collection of vines that would really help to accentuate something like a jungle and make it even more difficult to sort of traverse and climb through. Imagine this stretching over some bushes on the ground and a tree like right next to it, a mega jungle tree stretching up to the sky. That would be so cool. 1.20.5 even continues to give trees new tools. For example, we can now place blocks underneath trees. So for example, if you're making a tree in a snowy biome, trees obviously will block the snow from covering the ground. So you could use this decorator type to cover the ground underneath the tree with snow as well, just to add that additional snow cover and help it fit a little bit better with the rest of the biome. This is what's used to place the leaf litter underneath trees, though I'm using a much higher chance for the block to successfully place. There's a lot of really cool decorators like this. For example, if we go back to these amethyst roots here, we can add a decorator to allow it to change the ground that's underneath it into a mix of obsidian and crying obsidian. Again, we have that randomness with the block state provider, just to add even more accentuating to this purple design that's going on here. So let's try putting this all together and come up with some really awesome tree designs. This one here is a really cool custom crimson tree. We're using a mega trunk placer to have this really thick 2x2 trunk, but it's not super tall. It's not as tall as a mega jungle tree, for example. We have a mix of resin blocks and shroom lights, so it's not quite like a crimson fungus that you might find in the nether, but it does have the similar color palette, especially with the shroom lights. That really works well, especially on the underside with these crimson stems. We can alter the ground to be a mix of netherrack and crimson nylium, and use the place on ground decorator to have some crimson and roots and fungus underneath as well. This might be a design that you could find in the end to help decorate that and give it even more life. We're using a cherry trunk placer here to have a bunch of these branches holding up several arms with small pine foliage bits. These have a decorator that allows you to place additional decorations on the leaves. Here we're putting them on the underside, which is the way that mangrove propagules grow on mangrove trees, but you can place them on any direction or all directions. And then you could even use it to create something totally alien. Once again, that doesn't even look like a tree. This is a very short mega trunk that is using some roots to kind of be elevated just above the ground, made entirely of skulk. We're using skulk catalyst for the foliage, but with a very small foliage placer so that it only has a handful of them. We've got a chance for skulk sensors and skulk shriekers to generate on the roots, and then we're using the place on ground decorator to cover the entire ground with skulk veins, sensors, and shriekers as well. And of course, we're altering the ground as we have been, just to help this fit even better in with the environment. Now, even though trees are my favorite feature, and I've demonstrated a lot of various ways that you can use them to add some life and variety to your world, they aren't perfect. If we come back to the pale oak tree, we can get rid of it and place a new one, and you'll see that we have this pale moss that's covering the ground, and this is actually handled with a specific pale moss decorator, same with the hanging moss here. So we can configure the probability, the rarity of the hanging moss and the moss decoration down here, the moss carpet, but we can't actually change what those blocks are. You would have to use other decorators like the alter ground and hanging from leaves decorators in order to change those. And similar situation with the creaking heart. We can change the frequency that a creaking heart is going to spawn inside one of these trunks, but we can't change what that block is. That's a whole separate decorator. And that's something that can't be replicated with other existing decorators. So we don't have any way to really mess with that right now, besides just replacing it with a separate feature after the fact. The same situation is how beehives are handled, as well as the cocoa that can generate on the sides of jungle trees, although it looks like we didn't get any here. We can change the probability that those appear, but we can't actually change what those blocks are. However, 1.21.5, just like it added the place on ground decorator, also added the place on logs decorator, so that should be something that can be replicated now, unlike the creaking heart. This is a different kind of video than I've been making, but I hope it's been interesting to listen to me gush about trees. I just absolutely love worldgen, and if you do too, please remember to like and subscribe, because I have lots of new worldgen and custom structure videos coming down the pipeline that I hope that you will enjoy. Thanks for watching!